In reality, an autistic person probably needs a lot more accommodations than we're all led to realise. Autism, for many of us, is a disability.
Hey everyone, welcome to the BPD Bunch. I'm your host, Xannie, and today I am here with Carys and special guests, Toni and John. Where in the world is everyone coming from today?
I am in Ontario, Canada, where it is still quite chilly.
Los Angeles, California, United States. Hey.
Hi, I am in England, quite near London, but not inside London, and it feels like the first day of spring here, so that's really nice.
I'm coming from New Mexico in the United States. I'm super excited for this episode today. This has been requested by many members of our audience, BPD and autism. If this or other BPD related topics interest you, please make sure to like, subscribe, and turn your notifications so you do not miss anything. To start us off, since we do have a couple of special guests today, I want to do a quick round of what are your diagnoses and when and how did you receive them?
I'm Carys, and I was diagnosed with BPD in 2020. I have just received an ADHD diagnosis this year, and I'm in the process of an autism assessment.
I'm John. I got my I was told my BPD diagnosis in 2019 when I was in a residential mental health treatment program. And then I got my autism diagnosis in 2022 through a full battery assessment with an autism specialist.
I'm Toni, and I am 44 just, and I realised that I was autistic 3 years ago and got my full assessment and diagnosis 1 year ago privately. I'm pretty sure I've got ADHD, really quite confident about that, but I haven't requested an assessment for that yet, but I'm planning to.
I'm Xannie. I got my BPD diagnosis 21 years ago when I was hospitalized for an eating disorder. I do also have ADHD. I do not have autism, so I'm excited to sort of compare and contrast all of our experiences on this episode today. I don't know about anyone else watching, but I have seen so much information sort of explode on social media about autism. And of course, there are issues with the Diagnostic Statistical Manual. We don't have the capacity to go into the scope of the issues of the DSM today. We did, however, want to cover what the DSM criteria for autism are, just so that we have a more clinical understanding of what people mean when they are talking about an autism diagnosis. John is in graduate school for clinical psychology. So, John, could you share the DSM criteria for autism?
Yes. So I want to preface this with the current DSM criteria is the DSM-5-TR. And so what that means is that now autism can be co-diagnosed or comorbid with ADHD, which previously wasn't a thing. That being said, they did modify it. And according to the criteria, you need at least 3 areas of deficits and persistent deficits, rather, in social communication and social interactions across multiple contexts, meaning not just at home or not just at school. They are manifested in a variety of ways, ranging from social emotional reciprocity, so meaning like abnormal social approaches, failure of back and forth conversations, reduced sharing of interests, emotions, affect, struggling to initiate or respond to conversations, including nonverbal behaviors integrated in social interactions. So, for example, lack of eye contact or body language, or also struggles in developing, maintaining, understanding relationships. The second criteria, where you need at least 2 of the 4 types, meaning you could have all 4, but at least 2, restrictive, repetitive patterns of behavior, interests, or activities, meaning stereotyped repetitive movements, such as like flapping your hands, lining up toys, etc. Insistence on sameness, meaning struggles to change routines or ritualize patterns through verbal or nonverbal behavior. So, example, struggling with transitions or having really big stresses at small changes. Highly fixated interests that are abnormal in intensity or focus. For example, listening to the same song exclusively for like several months or a year kind of thing, or watching the same TV show over and over. You could have hyper or hyporeactivity to sensory input, meaning you could either be very sensitive to the touches and smells of your environment, or you could be needing more sensory input. The other thing is that while symptoms must be present in the early developmental period, which means childhood, toddlership, it can be diagnosed later as long as that's included in the pattern of symptoms. Also, these symptoms must be clinically significant in areas of functioning, whether that's social, occupational, personal. And specifically, these experiences are not better explained by either an intellectual disability or global developmental delay. That being said, intellectual disabilities are very comorbid with autism. And the other quite thing to note is that these experiences come on a wide spectrum, and the examples that are used in the DSM are not exhaustive, and they say that. But just to get a general idea.
So, John, one of the things that you mentioned that I want to ask a little bit more about was you said that previously autism and ADHD could not be diagnosed together. And that is now not the case. Could you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, so the important thing to know is that the DSM is historically an ever-changing guideline in accordance with new research. They're starting to realize that while they are 2 separate diagnoses, there are a lot of similarities that make sense to have that comorbid diagnosis to get people the right and accurate support. So there is now this shift to being able to diagnose the 2 together, but it's also important to note that research is ever evolving. This is what the current research shows, so that's what the DSM guidelines are going on about.
So now that we have covered the criteria, obviously a lot of those are relatively vague, right? So how do these criteria manifest as symptoms in your life?
Key things, I think, that really jump out for some of those categories for me. The reciprocity of communication is a very major part of my day-to-day life, in all of my interactions, all of my relationships, in all settings, including work. For me, this sounds really cold, but for me, communicating with somebody is about sharing information. So a lot of times I don't really see the point of having a talking conversation. I can see the point of this conversation. I can see the point of a lot of conversations I have in the workplace. Some of my conversations in the home are information exchange. Other than that, there isn't really much point from my perspective in talking or looking at people, or I'm happy being in the space with people. So, and similarly, I don't use body language as part of that data. So if I'm using my body, it's just my body feels like doing that. I'm not trying to convey something. And when I communicate with someone else, whatever they're doing with their body, I kind of just filter out, I kind of just ignore it because it doesn't feel relevant. So I'm actually quite comfortable. I'm most comfortable talking to another autistic person because they're less likely to to be thinking about body language and eye contact as being part of the exchange. So I think that's like quite a big thing. And of course, that kind of thing impacts massively on relationships. So the relationship part of the DSM, a lot of my relationships, a lot of my friendships have had like major struggle, major stress because of misunderstanding, because of misattributing, people assuming that I'm coming from somewhere I'm not, by not communicating or communicating in a certain way. So they're like really big things around that. And then the repetitive and sameness elements are really huge parts of my life. And they can, I think, look ritualized. I think if someone wouldn't understand how I've got to the point of doing what I'm doing, it can look like I'm doing it almost like because I'm following kind of a belief system or something. Actually, what happens is I end up in a very strict, very like detail crafted routine. I've got like a weekly routine, and it's taken a long time to develop it. And it's a routine that ensures all of my sensory and like overwhelm levels, all of my needs are met. And if one part of that routine gets dropped or goes out, all of it is affected, all of it, and all of it will unravel. And my dysregulation levels will amp up through the week. So the routine it's high stakes. You can't muck about with your routine. But then separately to that, I also think that my brain expects and demands the same kind of activity and the same kind of input at the same time each day. So often at like 3:00, my brain will be like, hey, let's listen to that song that we're listening to at the moment. And then immediately after work, it'll be like, well, let's obviously lie down on the heated blanket and watch art tutorial videos for 2 hours until it's time to make dinner every day. And so I never get tired. I never get tired of the same things because those things give me what I need. So no need to change. And change is so disruptive. So that's some of my main things, I think.
It's so funny because I can, with the ADHD that I have, I can kind of relate to some of the things that you're saying, but in other ways, not at all. Like I have no routines at all. Zero. Ooh. Like the only thing I do consistently is I drink coffee in the morning. But I do find a certain comfort in like hyper fixating on certain foods, right? Like eating the same foods regularly, batching things, because having to make decisions constantly about what I'm going to eat is very overwhelming. But if I imagine doing the same set of things every day, that is like my worst nightmare.
I just want to say, like, I can really relate to the information-based brain and like filtering out like the nonverbal body language. And that's why sometimes I prefer talking to autistic people too, because it's so direct. You just say what you mean and there's no hidden question about that. There's all these like hidden meanings in like conversations that I just don't understand. And it takes me a good like minute to try and use the knowledge that I have about social circles to kind of understand the point that they're trying to make. Because again, my brain is just so information based, and I don't view communication as clearly as like all those layers. I just view it as fact and this, you know?
How do non-autistic people know, like, how do they know what's meant to happen if they're because the only way to know for sure is to communicate directly. So between people for whom that isn't normal, natural, whatever, are they just guessing all the time? But I think that's the whole point of being autistic, right? Because we would be guessing, but they've got this like secret unspoken code, like signal back code thing that we can't see.
I think it is an intuition. I think it is a level because you were talking about how you filter out the body language. And for me, I'm not actively thinking about it. Like I'm just reacting to what I see.
I would say I don't have that intuition, and I don't think I ever did. I think like for me personally, it's something that I have to actively spend a decent amount of brain power to like not only recognize the information but integrate into the situation. And I think that's part of like what sometimes gets me in trouble is that if like someone's turned away, it doesn't signal to my brain that I'm not welcome. Like I have to consciously like think to myself, okay, they're turned away. Why are they turned away? What is the situation? What are they doing? Have they said that I'm invited or not? Like, are they just turned away because that's what the space requires? Or are they turned away because they're trying to tell me something? And if they are trying to tell me something, what are they trying to tell me? And it's like all these steps and almost like check boxes to try and figure out like one specific behavior, you know? Like I remember once when I was in an acting class and we're doing this thing where it's like we had to kind of create a scene using like back and forth repetitive dialogue. And so he's like you're telling me with your body language that you're cross-legged, so you're guarded, but your feet are turned towards me, so I know you still want to engage in this conversation. And I'm like, where did any of that come from? Like I stood there in shock kind of because I'm like, that's not at all something I was even consciously aware of. My body just moves how it moves.
So I think for me, one of the ways it shows up in my life for sure I'm just going to jump on the body language train because it's kind of what we were rolling with. When I'm interacting with my amazing partner, Jeremy, and he is becoming overstimulated by potentially my tone or the topic of conversation or something. And we both have ADHD. And so we both tend to get a little jumpy and emotionally reactive at times. So I just remember over and over, like at the beginning of our relationship, we would have this argument and it would end the same way. And it would be him saying, "You can see I'm obviously agitated. Why do you keep pushing?" And my response every time was, "I can't see that it is not obvious to me that you're agitated. The only way I can tell you're agitated is when you start yelling at me." And then I'm like, "Why are you yelling at me? We were just talking." And because that conversation happened so often, I started to pay attention to things that I hadn't paid attention to before. And I noticed he gets shaky leg when he's beginning to become agitated. And if I catch myself at the shaky leg stage, then I de-escalate. Maybe I change the topic of conversation or like graciously exit the whatever. Then it doesn't escalate. And I was like, holy cow, this is, again, an example of me not noticing body language and what it could be interpreted as. Because for me, I start shaking. It's not because I'm agitated. Sometimes it is. But often it's just because I'm shaking something, like I'm fidgeting or whatever. So it doesn't seem relevant always. I think like stuff like that, when it happens at a stage that is higher stakes, then that's when we can feel more of the effect of it. And when we're talking to people who love us and have grace for us and compassion and understanding, it's easier to move past things like this. But when you've got BPD and autism, it's like it's like a double whammy of like trying to be mindful of all the things that your brain has to prune out because you are getting emotionally escalated. So it's like my emotions are getting big and I have to be more mindful of things that I normally can't be. So it's hard.
So you brought up BPD. What can you identify as clearly different between autism and BPD? Like, how do you differentiate between those as separate diagnoses within yourself?
For me, I think it's kind of interesting because they feel somewhat more intertwined in a way. What I tend to notice is that where my autism will find joy in, say, like the same TV show, my BPD is more the emotional intensity of that's associated, where it's like, for example, I could listen to the same song 100 times, and I actually have been doing that for the past week with this new song that was released. But what I also notice is that even though that's my autism acting up, my BPD acts up by idolizing the band that created that song.
I see my BPD as a symptom of autistic trauma. Being autistic, growing up without knowing it, and being chronically misunderstood and not being able to express my thoughts or emotions in ways that would be effectively understood by those around me almost forced them to become large. So I see my development of BPD as being a symptom. Sounds weird, but like, it's like my BPD symptoms are a symptom. They're just like the natural consequence, I guess, of chronic invalidation and the inability to communicate effectively.
Yeah, I feel very similarly about what Carys and I have talked about this before, but it's for me, it's the ADHD and BPD, but a very similar story. Like, not in an environment that was conducive for my neurodivergence, and then BPD became the maladaptive coping that I used to deal with that. So I completely relate to that experience. Toni, one of the things that we talked about, you mentioned, I think when we were planning for this episode, was monotropism. Is that the word? I was wondering if you had anything you wanted to share on that.
Monotropism is not part of the diagnostic criteria specifically, but it is a trait. But as far as I understand it, monotropism really relates, I think, to the experience of being most naturally inclined to be single focused, like in a moment, but also just sort of like generally in life and over time. So my experience of that, and the way that I think of monotropism as being a big part of my life, is being required to multitask. So if you're like having a conversation with someone whilst trying to do something, or whilst trying to walk along and look at signage, or anything that splits your focus, basically, it's almost like it physically hurts, like it's a traumatic experience. It's incredibly tiring. So even if you have to do it in the moment, and you can do it in the moment, you kind of have to recover from that. It's an incredibly intense experience.
What's also very interesting is that, like, in that monotropic, we become very uncomfortable with change. And that's actually something that I kind of got in trouble with my undergrad, being the president of my own chapter, or student org rather, was trying to adapt to the various changes that my leadership team was suggesting to me, and me trying to find some comfortability in these like last minute changes when I was like, but I scheduled my whole day around this.
It's really interesting because we're sort of comparing and contrasting with BPD, and I can like both really relate, but also really not with the change thing, because like for me, I'm incredibly impulsive. I love being spontaneous, doing something that I didn't plan. I don't have problems with sudden changes as long as they are my sudden changes. Yeah. But if somebody else comes in and is like, no, we're going to do this, I struggle with the change because I am so attached to my feelings about things. So, like if I was going to go shopping, buying fabric or something, and, somebody's like, oh no, we're going to go do this other thing. I'd be like, but I had this whole beautiful image in my head of what I was going to do today, and you're ruining my beautiful image. Like, what's wrong with you? So I just think it's really interesting that there can be, and I think this is where there's a lot of conversation about people having both BPD and autism, because they're, or like the discussion being, do I have both? Is it one or the other? And kind of wondering that, because behaviorally or symptomatically, it's very similar. I think the motivations just may be slightly different, because as I'm understanding it, it's not necessarily that you're like emotionally attached to your vision. It's more like the change itself is an unexpected stimulus that you then have to react to, right? And so I just think that's such a fascinating thing when we're talking about these differences. And why diving into this is really important, because unless you understand someone's motivations, you could diagnose people with all kinds of things under the sun, but from my perspective, what makes it different is the motivation, right? You can't just take a behavior and be like, oh, it's this. You have to understand why it's happening. And on that note, one of the things that we've been asked a lot, I posted a reel about the emotion hangover in BPD, sort of when you're emotionally exhausted after having a really intense emotional experience. And I got a lot of comments from people who were like, well, this sounds a lot like what happens after an autistic meltdown. So this is the big question. Is there a difference, a descriptive difference between a BPD episode and an autistic meltdown? Are there actual differences? Let's dive into that. What are your thoughts?
So I don't know if this is true for you, Toni or Carys, but one thing that I have noticed, and in talking to my therapist, who is essentially like a neurodivergent expert, is that autistic trauma can look very similar to like a BPD experience. If I'm in a autistic meltdown, I'm rocking back and forth, I'm crying, I'm listening to like my same music, my specific music to get me through that. Sometimes I'm punching my like chest, in like a repetitive way. And then afterwards, I'm so burnt out that like I can't cook for myself. I can't clean. The only thing I can do is essentially like lay and watch my specific TV show that I know is like my safe TV show, the one that I can watch 1,000 times over and still not be bored about,
I'm thinking that I cannot honestly say that I have ever had a BPD episode that was not caused by an autistic meltdown. I will say, before I knew I was autistic, I did not know how to calm myself down afterwards. I did not know what kind of aftercare I would need. So there are so many of us who have been undiagnosed or improperly diagnosed who may have both. And there's no shame in either, which is one thing I just need to get out there. There is zero shame in a diagnosis. It is literally just some words people use to help us make sense out of the shitty situation we happen to be in. So I have both. I don't qualify for a BPD diagnosis currently, and I haven't in a couple of years because I don't have the number of symptoms required. That doesn't mean I don't still have BPD episodes. That doesn't mean I don't have autistic meltdowns. What it does mean is that I'll have a meltdown, I will have an episode, and then I know how to self-soothe afterwards. I can bring myself down before I experience the feelings of emptiness, before I want to self-harm, before I need to do any of the behaviors that I did before when my BPD was rampant. But as soon as I recognized what my actual needs were and what was causing the episode, which was a meltdown, and what caused the meltdown, oh, okay, now I can control certain factors in my life to reduce the frequency of them and never let the intensity get so bad that I'm considering self-harm or these other things.
So, Toni, what does an autistic meltdown feel and look like to you?
So I've been having meltdowns my whole life, but I've only known for the last 3 years what they were. And it was around that time where, because of being burned out, because of my needs not having been met all my life, where I used to, I think, feel it, but push it down and internalize it in my adulthood. Couldn't do that as a child, couldn't do that as a teenager, my adulthood. But then more recently, it all kind of exploded out again. And I was having meltdowns like John described. So when I have a meltdown, it's in my body. It's very much in, I feel like my nervous system fizzing up. My first tell, which my partner is very familiar with, so normally he starts helping me navigate out of wherever we are. My first thing, I'll start tapping like this on my sternum or on my forehead. Not deliberately, it just happens. I usually can't get thought into word, and I don't know whether it's a motor control thing or what, but I can't form words and sentences. I'll usually feel like I need to cry, and I'll be kind of trying to hold that in. But if I'm somewhere really safe, now that I know what it is and I'm not afraid of it anymore, I actually know that the best thing for my body is to have the meltdown, lean into it, like, because my body needs to explode. It needs to do whatever it needs to do. So my full autistic meltdown does involve rocking. It will involve this. I will wail, like I'm loud and I'm noisy. That is my real full autistic meltdown. It is not an emotional experience anymore. It was when I was a child and a teenager. It was I was so scared that it would then become, I would then have panic attacks on top of the meltdown because I was so scared and nobody helped me. Now I have my meltdown and then I'm very tired, very, very tired. And I have a long nap and then I watch my cozy shows and I eat something gentle and drink something gentle and have a rest. But there's nothing emotional attached to it anymore.
Okay, maybe that is the difference, because absolutely necessarily for me in a BPD episode, I think there's two things that are absolutely part of it. It's an emotional reaction to something situational, almost always with another person, and it necessarily involves splitting about the situation. Some sort of catastrophic thought. Oftentimes it happens in a relationship with somebody else. It's like a catastrophic thought, like, oh, my person's going to leave me over this, or like, we're going to get divorced over this argument. Physically, it's very similar to what you describe. There's a lot of flailing. There's a lot of like sort of like intense sobbing, sometimes rocking in the fetal position, but it is 100% an emotional experience. It is like deep despair. And for me, the flailing is mostly like a desperate attempt to get the emotion out of my body, because I feel like my heart is going to shatter into a million pieces. Like, I literally have this sense of like, I'm going to die if I keep this emotion in my body. So all of the, like, I've hit myself before, there's a lot of flailing, but it's this like, just get it out. I can't live with this. Like, I can't live with this in my body. I don't know. So it's interesting because, like, again, it's like surface, like observationally, they look very similar, but it's so interesting to hear you say that it's not like an emotional experience, because for me, a BPD episode is necessarily an emotional experience.
Yeah, I think to me, that's kind of what I was trying to get at. And I think, Toni, and you've really explained it well. For me, an autistic meltdown is purely like non-emotional, but a reaction in a way to the overstimulation that I'm experiencing. And when I'm not in a safe environment to express that overstimulation safely, I like shut down emotionally and I physically like can't speak even if I try to. And sometimes I feel like it's very hard to move my body because it's not emotional. It's purely just this stimulation is way too much for my body to handle. So I'm going to cope with it in the way that I need to. Whereas like a BPD episode is purely emotional for me, and often I would say 8 or 9 times out of 10 is triggered by a fear of like abandonment, like, oh my God, they're going to leave me. Oh my God, I'm never going to see them again. Oh my God, I can't live without that kind of thing. Where like my autism reactions is purely just like, I can't process this stimulation at all. Like it's overloading my system kind of thing. And it's not emotional, it's more biological in a way for me.
Well, I was really curious about, Toni, how your meltdowns were before you knew they were meltdowns. I feel like if I am baseline overstimulated but unconscious of it because I don't know my autistic needs, and then an emotional thing happens, that is the straw that breaks the camel's back, or that's what causes the bubble of water at the top of the glass to overflow. So I get overstimulated by my emotional response to the thing that happens in my relationship because my body is already baseline overstimulated and I'm unaware of it.
Yeah, I think maybe a difference between my experience and yours is potentially that I might be at the point of something being able to trigger me because I'm at that point, but it's unlikely for me that it will be something emotional that triggers it, because I don't have intense emotional reactions to most things.
I feel very similar to that, especially since I went through trauma treatment. I did neurofeedback for like 6 months, and it completely reshifted my intensity of emotional experiences. And now I don't really feel emotions nearly as tensely. And so it's not something that like really overstimulates me. And maybe that's partly because it was more childhood trauma, but it's also like it's hard to say because this is something that persisted into adulthood, and I was given that diagnosis of BPD. So there's that question if I was misdiagnosed with BPD or if I wasn't, but it's hard. Yeah, that's currently what I've noticed.
So just to say, I did used to get triggered by emotional experiences as a teenager and in my 20s to some extent. And I haven't mentioned this yet, but I haven't felt for a long time like I was anywhere in the realm of BPD. But when I've looked at BPD information, I have thought to myself at this point in my life, I think there were periods in my life where, because of my complex trauma around my unsupported, undiagnosed ADHD and having parents that I believe have very complicated neurodivergence themselves and were very, very controlling, I think when I was younger, I could have been somewhere in the realm around BPD type experiences, and I had very explosive emotional responses, more so in response to being controlled. And that's still kind of a theme for me. Like, if someone tries to control me, I don't have an explosive reaction, but I will have a reaction which is avoidance. I need to get away from them. But it's not it's not a big emotional response. It's just, this is not acceptable. I'm out.
So it sounds like we had really similar experiences then, Toni, like at one point in our lives, like at different points. Because for me, it wasn't as a teenager or early 20s. It was more like it was probably late 20s to early 40s for me, because I experienced more relationship trauma during that time. But it sounds like it would be similar, because like undiagnosed, unsupported autism, keeping you at a high level baseline, and then the emotional trigger brings on a BPD episode, if you will.
Yeah, maybe.
I think for me, I had like a similar thing, but what I'm starting to notice, or at least what a lot of like I've realized through therapy, is that a lot of my triggers in childhood were more so reactions to overstimulation and it being already an extreme burnout, that my emotions were already super heightened without that support, without a label, despite me going to like countless therapists, doctors being like, hey, this is something I'm struggling with, but I don't have a word for it. And so my parents had no idea for some reason, but somehow through looking all my clinical notes in childhood, it's like, yeah, he met the criteria all this time for autism. We just didn't want to diagnose him with that. And so that lack of support and accommodation led to me just really having a heightened sensitivity to begin with. And then when there was that like emotional trigger, even if like otherwise I wouldn't experience emotions as intensely, it was like a coin switch and I became very explosive. But I would say like through a diagnosis and understanding my triggers, I don't really have that experience anymore where like emotions trigger me. But I will say for the most part, in childhood at least, they presented more as autistic meltdowns that were externalized and towards other people, which could look very similar to like a BPD episode. But I noticed that more of my BPD symptoms manifested in, I would say, like my late teens and up until like, I would say 2021, where it was like that time frame. It was like if there was even a symbol of someone abandoning me, like even just leaving the room, I would freak out. And that's where those BPD episodes kind of manifested for me.
Well, it's really interesting to hear you all talk about, you know, some of these reactions in response to overstimulation, because I experience overstimulation, but I've never had a meltdown in reaction to it. I always have a rage episode. If I'm overstimulated, my default is rage. I don't cry. I don't throw a fit. I'm usually breaking things or screaming. Well, not so much anymore because I usually do my best to avoid that. But like that is, you know, like there have been times where I've put on, like, my skin is very sensitive. There have been times I've put on like old leggings and the seams have gotten kind of pilly. And I just tear them off. Like, I'm like, tearing them off, throwing them away, like that kind of thing. But it ends there, right? That's it. That's the whole thing. That's the whole moment.
That's what my meltdowns looked like for a long time. Through my teens and 20s and 30s, because it is not okay at that point in your life to rock and wail, and like no one in my life would have been okay with that. I would have been like, I just can't imagine having let go like that around anyone. My parents would have gone ballistic if I had been like that around them. So I just thought I had rage issues because I would be overstimulated and it would just go straight to violence, straight to break stuff. But I wasn't allowed to break stuff, so it went straight to hurt myself. So for years, I just thought I had rage problems, that I'm violent and I would be violent and crying. And that's what my meltdowns looked like for a really long time, until I totally dissociated in my 30s. It's only since understanding that I'm autistic and the autistic stuff, kind of the mask, we talk about the mask in autism. I had been masking for years, not able to mask any of the social, all of that stuff, because I can't pretend to be something different. But I had been masking my dysregulation and my meltdown stuff. But when I got burned out, it all just came out. And it was so confusing because I was like, what is this tapping? What is this rocking? What is this? What is all of this? Because I had been suppressing it for a long, long, long time. So now that I let myself do the classic autistic meltdown stuff, it doesn't come out as violence in the same way anymore.
What advice would you give to others who are living either with BPD and autism or just autism? What strategies or insights have you found particularly helpful?
I think for me, the biggest thing was learning what my levels need to be. Like, how much is too much of anything? And I know that's so broad, but if you think about it as my life in a Sims game, like, how much social interaction do I need? How many interviews can I take or lead in a week? How much food, rest, how much noise, how many social interactions on a base level? It's all of these little things that when I know what I am, I look at myself as a science project. Like, I'm sciencing myself. What do I need? And if I keep my levels within my window of tolerance, then I don't have as many issues with my BPD symptoms. So it's just know yourself, get curious about yourself. Don't be judgmental about yourself. Be curious about it. Like, go and experience weird and wild things, and then don't just block out what happened after it. Analyze it. Sit with it. And like, maybe I needed more social interaction than I thought I did. Maybe I require going out to someplace loud and chaotic, even though my brain thinks I want something calm. But be experimental instead of judgmental.
Validate your experience and take care of like your basic needs. So food, water, rest, those kinds of things. Because I think that makes it a lot easier to handle both BPD and autism. But on the BPD side, kind of looking for alternative scenarios. For example, if someone leaves the room, yes, they could be leaving to go home and you may never see them again. Or the other possibility is that they remember you and try to reach out, looking for alternative, more gray and optimistic outlooks rather than just like allowing yourself to like spiral. Because I think those spirals of like abandonment for me are like a huge thing. But in an autistic sense, I would say find safe spaces to allow yourself to unmask, stim, and get your like autistic needs met in a way. And an example of this actually is a couple weeks ago, I saw a live taping of After Midnight, and I realized nobody was paying attention to me. I was sitting there by myself because I'd gone by myself, and I literally just sat there waiting to be let in, and I just like stimmed. I just kind of like let my autistic kind of go bonkers. And after that, I was not nearly exhausted as I usually am after like a social situation. And that was a very safe and secure way to unmask because there was no reason for people to be concerned about me. And also they checked bags. So it's not like there was any reason for me to be in danger. But if you're in an environment that doesn't feel helpful, maybe unmasking in your bedroom, or if you live alone, unmasking in your apartment, and just allowing yourself to find those autistic moments of joy, because without that and without like just getting your autistic needs met, it's gonna be a very negative impact on your other areas of life.
Yeah, I would definitely say that at the very least, it is important, I think, as an autistic person to unmask to yourself. And I think it is true and real that there are autistic people who, because of other characteristics, may never be safe to unmask around anyone else. But it is important that you are real with yourself so that you can at least understand what your real self-expression, like your real essence, your real you. We deserve to know that in our lifetimes, I think. but also so that you can get in touch with what I would say is get really serious about trying to identify your sensory needs, because I think a lot of autistic people become disconnected, whether they were diagnosed young or early or late, because things like stimming are so stigmatized. We do become very dissociated from our sensory needs. So it's important to really tune into those, and to be open to the fact that actually, in reality, an autistic person probably needs a lot more accommodations in day-to-day life than we're all led to realize them. But even level 1 autistic people need a high level of accommodation. It's still a diagnosable condition. Like, it's a high level of accommodation. So I think it's I have said this on social media and stuff recently. It's like, be prepared once you kind of start getting to know yourself and your real needs. Be prepared to encounter the fact that autism, for many of us, is a disability and needs a lot of support. So it's worth also thinking a lot about being discerning as you grow older and you have more autonomy about who you let into your life as well. Because if there's anyone in your life who invalidates your real autistic self and expression and needs, they are poison. The end.
Snaps to all of that.
Oh, I enjoyed the snaps. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Toni and John, for joining us for this episode. Can you share with our audience where they can find more from you?
You can find my personal Instagram at john.matthews.ok, or you can connect with me through Zzam. Those are the two best ways to get in contact with me.
So I've got a podcast called Autistic at 40, which I've actually just stopped, but I have 2 series of it with loads of stuff. And I'm on Instagram, and I'm pretty prolific, because posting about all of this is one of my major special interests. So I'm pretty intense on there. And that's autistic_@_40_podcast is my handle on Insta.
Well, thank you everyone so much for watching. We hope you got a nugget of wisdom to take with you on your journey. Friday, we'll be back to talk about how we deal with these various diagnoses at parties. Sunday, we've got a fun brunch episode coming out, and next Wednesday, we will be back with a brand new discussion topic. If you can't wait until then, please consider supporting our top 2 tiers on Patreon. Our BPD buddies and BPD besties get early access to extended cuts of our Wednesday episodes. So next week's episode is already up on Patreon right now. If you want to go check it out, the link is in the description down below, and we will see you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.